Hi, everybody. Oh my gosh, people don't usually answer back. That was so nice. You have such a nice group. It's a call and response. All right, we ready? Good evening, everyone. I'm Gemma Birnbaum, Executive Director of the American Jewish Historical Society, and we are thrilled to welcome author Shaul Kellner and our moderator for the evening, Gal Beckerman, for a discussion of Shaul's new book, A Cold War Exodus: How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews. We will have Q&A near the end of the program, and so during the discussion, if you have a question, please write it down on the note cards provided to you at check-in, and an AJHS staff member will collect them when the time comes. This program is being recorded and will be available to the public on the AJHS website and YouTube page. And after the program, please join us in the Great Hall, where you'll be able to purchase or pick up your copy of A Cold War Exodus, enjoy some drinks. And just thank you to all the activists who are here today. It's really nice to see you in the building and not just in the archives, which is what we usually see every day. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And Gal, take it away.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to be here. I see some familiar faces. I feel that panic that I remember when I would do Soviet Jewry talks and then look out and see the people who were actually like the characters in the book, yeah. Which is like something that fiction writers don't have to deal with. You know, I have been waiting a very long time for Shaul's book. We've met over many years. I think the last time was in Nashville when Shaul introduced me to hot chicken, and I am particularly excited about the book for the kind of two great insights that I feel like it has, and that this is sort of going to be the direction that I want to take things, because I have a lot of questions for you. The first kind of, in my mind, fascinating sort of breakthrough that Shaul makes in this book as a sociologist is to look at the Soviet Jewry movement as a cultural movement, which, you know, maybe seems obvious, but, you know, having looked at it myself as a sort of a political movement and a social movement, the idea of the sort of culture that the Soviet Jewry movement created is fascinating to think about in depth. And I can say personally, as somebody who had a bar mitzvah twin, a Soviet twin, like that was my entry point, was the kind of wider culture that the Soviet Jewry movement created. So I want to talk about that. And then this sort of related insight, which is the fact that this culture that the Soviet Jewry movement created actually helped create American Jews, or helped sort of form a big part of American Jewish identity at a critical, pivotal moment in their evolution in the 20th century. So that's the kind of other turn that I want to take in our conversation. So, but first, I just want to ask sort of a more foundational question, which is sort of, how did you come to think about the Soviet Jewry movement in this way?
As a cultural movement.
Yeah.
This project actually started as a graduate school paper.
Okay.
And it was a course on religious protest movements. I needed to choose a movement, and I knew I wanted to study sociology of American Jews. And this was a movement. I was not an activist. I was tangentially involved. I had twinned my bar mitzvah. I wrote a few op-eds in college about it. I was in Israel for junior year abroad when Soviet immigrants were coming in, and I was going to the airport to meet them, but I was not really involved. So I mean, in some ways, I think about this book as my penance for not having done more. But as I was doing the research, the stuff that lit me on fire was the culture of the movement. And I'm looking at what people are writing about, and most of the stuff that people were writing about was the lobbying, was the political, a lot on Jackson Vanik,
right,
and this effort to tie American trade relations to Soviet immigration policy. And that was interesting, but that's not where my own interests were. That's not where they lie. And part of it was this combination of seeing there's a gap. Everyone who's talking about this movement is talking about the policy.
Right.
And from my experience, as one who was tangentially involved, it was not about the policy. It was about the experiences of a 13-year-old kid writing letters to Leonid Barras, not getting letters back, and learning from that those Soviet bastards are censoring the mail because they're anti-Semites. That's what I learned. from it. I come to the American Jewish Historical Society archives to do this research. I later learned he was not writing back because he was already in Israel. But that's another story.
I can tell you a story about my Soviet twin also. But I want to dig in on the Soviet twin actually for a second before we go wider. Just personally, when you think back about sort of what that did for you as a 13-year-old, like what did it connect you with? What did it make you aware of? What did it sort of plug you into? Like what are those, like if you do a sociology of the self, you know, when you think about that?
Yeah. You know, it's hard for me at this point to analyze my own experience alone because I've read so many Bar and Bat Mitzvah speeches, twinning speeches, and seen so much of the documentation that at this point I'm not clear on what's my own experience and what is it now that I've been immersed in. It's this pivotal moment in the Jewish life cycle. We're coming of age. Today I am a man. I'm an American teenager today, and at this moment when I'm saying, okay, now I'm standing up independently as a Jew. I'm taking my responsibility. It's not just religious responsibility. The thing that I'm doing is I'm speaking out on behalf of other Jews who need support. And I'm doing this in a ritual context. It's also, I'm doing this it's 1980s, it was 1982 for me. So it's Reagan era. You know, this is the Cold War is chilling at this point. You know, and I'm saying freedom, freedom, freedom. And what does it mean to come of age? Here as a 13-year-old kid, I will tell all of the adults, hey, I'm fulfilling my Jewish responsibility. What are you doing? And this was an experience that tens of thousands of American Jewish kids had.
Yeah. I think for me, mine was Maxim Yankelevich. That was my guy, who I at some point when I was on book tour for When They Come For Us, somebody in the crowd after one of the events said, I know Max. He lives in New Jersey. And I was like, no, you don't. This is not the same guy. It turned out to be the guy, I think for me, it was sort of an awareness of Jewish persecution or Jewish suffering that was sort of not really in my own consciousness at that. I think I grew up with Holocaust survivor grandparents, and I was like, in my mind, I think there was a bifurcation of sort of the world after, the world before and the world after that event. And then this was sort of a fly in the ointment, was, what does it mean that there's a kid who's my age who can't do this basic thing that's a Jewish right? Like it sort of exploded my mind that way.
And this is happening over there. And the reason that we could twin our bar mitzvahs with these poor Soviet kids was because we were safe. Because America was different. Anti-Semitism, that was a problem back then. It's a problem overseas. We are secure, we are proud, we are empowered, we are free American Jews, and we're going to use that position and that privilege. I wouldn't have framed it that way as a 13-year-old in the 80s, but we're going to use that position and that privilege to help. Because if we don't do it, who else is going to do it? Yeah, and even the Israelis can't do it, right? This is the Cold War. We are citizens of the United States of America. If anyone is going to be able to put pressure on the Soviet government, it's going to be the US government. And this is our government. These are our representatives. And they answer to us as citizens. So we can, we communicate with them. And it was a consensus issue.
So tell me how you decided to look at the culture of the Soviet Jewry movement, or the culture that it sort of created. And how did you set the boundaries? Like, how did you decide to look at twinning, but not just twinning, but like what were the various elements that made up your research?
I started by looking at the religious ritual. Because the course that I was taking was, and it's really like the course provided structure. This is a course on religious protest movements, and I looked at how student struggle for Soviet Jewry mobilized the Passover holiday. Freedom Seders, and then I looked at how the American Jewish Committee on Soviet Jewry introduced the matzoh of hope. So it started Passover ritual. And then expanded from there to looking at other religious rituals, other holiday rituals. How did the activists mobilize Jews in their holiday moments? How did they mobilize the religion to create the sense that, well, to actually create this reality where this was a mitzvah, that you had a religious obligation to speak out, And how did they do that? And when I switched from articles to a book project, I had to think, okay, so this is one dimension of culture, but what else is there? And if I'm looking at the religious, I want to look at the very, very secular. And that's what brought me into the Freedom Runs, which is the 1970s fitness fad, because we all thought it was going to end, the Pepsi boycott, the jewelry. So things that, that people will dismiss pop culture. They'll dismiss soda, they'll dismiss running, but like this is what we do. I mean, how many of you in the audience here woke up this morning and went for a jog, right? So this is just, or had a drink, or had a pepper, had Diet Pepsi, right? This is, or Diet Coke, right? A Diet Coke, because we're still boycotting Pepsi, I suppose. But this is just fundamental to how we as moderns in a consumer society create identity. So I wanted to look at that too. And then I had done research on Jewish tourism to Israel, the Birthright Israel trips.
Right.
So I've always had this interest in tourism. And there's a really interesting connection here with travel, American Jews and others from the West to the Soviet Union. They were a combination of aid visits, adventure, voluntourism, to bring assistance to Soviet Jews and to bring information out. So I had this tourism lens, so I knew I wanted to have something on there. And for me, how did I cut things? I could have had more and more chapters on other dimensions. So there's no chapter in here, for example, on package delivery and letter writing and phone calls, which was an important way that activists connected.
Right.
I dealt with that in the sections on twinning and in some of the sections on how they mobilize kids. But I had to cut it somewhere. I chose the things that I thought were the most prominent: the twinning, the bracelets, the travel, the ritual, a little bit around those edges, and then I said enough. And if there's more, I'll write articles, or someone else can do it.
Now, what's interesting is that when people think about movements, they think about sort of protesting in the streets, marches, demonstrations. This constellation of activities you're looking at are sort of ways that people were interacting with this cause, but not necessarily in any kind of traditional sort of activist ways.
Yeah. We have very narrow ways in popular culture of thinking about activism. So we think about it generally as protest out in the streets, and we'll often think about it as a youth. Now, this was a movement that was intergenerational. Okay, we had Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry that's mobilizing boomers. We had the American Jewish Conference on Soviet Jewry and the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews, who are the silent generation, and World War II veterans, the greatest generation, who are leading this stuff. So this and Gen Xers like us, who then got involved. This is something that crossed generations, and this goes to the issue of what makes this a culture. If all that a movement does is take people to the streets, it's a very, very narrow slice of human existence, right? What happens when you're alone in your house? What happens when you're at work? What happens if you're religious in your religious spaces, right? This was a movement that in every space where Jews were, it found ways to engage them. I think about it through the Shema prayer. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and you shall speak these words diligently to your children. They created curricula to teach this stuff to their kids. When you, help me with this, right? When you lie us down and when you rise us up. Jewelry. People would put a bracelet on with the name of a Soviet Jewish prisoner, put a medallion on around their neck when they wake up in the morning. And when they go to sleep, they take it off. At that very moment, you're thinking about Soviet Jewry. It's a very, very intimate moment when you're getting dressed and undressed, right? When you walk by the way, right? Well, walking by the way, they're going out, they're jogging. For Soviet Jews. When they're traveling, tourism, they're mobilizing for Soviet Jews, right? Sit in my house, the Passover rituals at home when they're reading the matzoh. Every moment. And this, I think, was the key insight that Soviet Jewry activists had, was that anyone and anything was available to be mobilized for the cause.
Well, so that was my next question, was how conscious, activist leaders were in sort of creating that culture.
We can ask some of the activists. You can ask some of the activists who are here. Like I felt that there were glimmers in the documents that activists had some awareness of that they really needed to cast a wide net. Not every individual and not every group did everything. So the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. And when you look at it from that holistic perspective, you really see how different people focused on different things. So you had educators, for example, but they're camp counselors. What are they going to do? How are they going to mobilize? Well, they'll mobilize in their jobs. They will mobilize in the summer camps. right? The people who are not working in summer camps are not thinking about that. So I'm hoping part of what this book does is, if this was an implicit knowledge that people had, that it now takes that implicit knowledge and it makes it explicit so that activists for today are able to use this, that we can learn from this. So I don't know how much of this was explicit. It was never codified.
Right.
But there was an awareness that they needed to, that there's a great story that Yossi Klein Halevi tells in his autobiography about Glenn Richter going to him when he's a little kid, and Yossi Klein Halevi, he's what, an elementary schooler. Can I help? And Glenn, who's number 2 at the student struggle, says, yes, you are now the elementary school chair, right? And you tell that story in your book too. But right before that happens, he's going around and he throws some cards into a baby carriage and says, even babies can help. Okay, so yeah, I know there's at least one activist who saw even babies can help. It was not just one activist. There were more who recognize that. But they systematize it, and that's the crazy thing. That these were not just one-offs. Once they came up with something, they began to experiment with their tactics, and they mixed them and they matched them. So you get the twinning, for example, which there were lots of paths. Twinning just doesn't happen. That's like one of the when we think back about this movement, for those who lived through it, the tactics are familiar. We know about the twinning. We know about the bracelets. We know about Passover. So it seems like it's just obvious that they would have done this. Nothing was obvious. They had to invent all the stuff. How did they do it? So twinning, it comes about through all these different ways. They were doing letter writing and prisoner adoption. They were doing mobilization of children as a separate thing. They bring these together, and that's one of the ways that you get twinning.
Interesting.
Yeah. It took time to get there.
Right, and it's not obvious. There's not, I mean, when you look at sort of the spectrum of social movements, they don't all have this dimension. I mean, and particularly not recently, when we still get the big movements in the United States. When I'm sitting here talking to you and I'm remembering, in my most recent book, I have this chapter on the Chartist movement in the 19th century in England, which was about getting the vote, expanding the franchise. And they created a similar sort of culture. There was like, Chartist powdered milk, and people would sign their letters, with you, a Chartist. They sort of, it became part of an identity, which I think is certainly an important part of it.
Yeah, I think that some of this may be Europe versus America, 19th century modes of mobilization versus later 20th century. There was certainly a sense, among the revolutionary movements in Europe, that culture was part of the revolution.
Right.
So you don't leave it untouched. But in America, we seem, and maybe it's that we think in more technical terms. That sort of got lost. But who knows? Maybe it's that we have European roots. I don't know what it is.
Right.
This movement operated
like
differently.
That,
and the fact that it became a cultural movement is what sustained it for the 3 decades. If it had just been a policy movement, it was only about Jackson Vanik, then if, there's a huge debate over, was Jackson Vanik a success, was it a failure, how did it help, how did it not help? If it was just a matter of policy, people would not have stayed engaged.
Well, that actually leads me to another question, which is the question of time, which is you're dealing with a movement where you don't know when it's going to, well, you certainly don't know if it's going to achieve its aims, but even if it is, you don't know when, right? You're asking people to commit themselves to a really sort of indefinite period of struggle. Even though the aims are clear, right? Free up immigration, we want the Jews to get out. Nobody knows how long that's going to take. So you have to keep people engaged, Solidarity Sunday after Solidarity Sunday. And this seems to be the kind of this cultural dimension as a way to do it.
Yeah, and it balances, I think about it in terms of the timeless and the timely.
Right.
So you think about the religious ritual. Every Passover raising the matzoh of hope, or every Simchat Torah. This Simchat Torah, as we think about Simchat Torah for the coming first anniversary of the October 7th massacres, I think it's important to think back to how Simchat Torah was, after Passover, the central moment of Jewish pride and mobilization and empowerment in the American Jewish calendar, in the Soviet Jewish calendar, and to some extent in the Israeli Jewish calendar. But this was, once it becomes religious ritual, and it doesn't matter if the Soviets aren't listening, you have an obligation to do this regardless.
Right.
Because your obligation is to your people and to your God.
Right. Just
Right?
like any form of ritual. It's
Exactly.
Not, yeah.
So that keeps it, that can help sustain it.
Yeah.
And also, look, they also were able to keep it timely. If it was only religious ritual, that alone also would not have been enough. But
Right.
no, it's the fitness fad. Everyone's going out jogging. Right? So you want to make this timely for the late 70s and early 80s? Let's start having freedom runs for Soviet Jewry.
Right.
You can do the most American thing. The most American thing is to go out. There's one of the authors of one of the trip reports went to the Soviet Union, was jogging in a Mickey Mouse t-shirt and sunglasses, and she writes, I felt so American doing this. This was such an American thing to do.
Right.
Right? So much in the moment. And they combine both of them.
Right. On the religious sort of dimensions, I know, we know that student struggle, a lot of those, Glenn Richter can tell us, a lot of those students were, yeshiva students. They had like, that religious language was very familiar to them, and sort of integrating, was integrating the movement into their religious practice, religious ritual life. Would that have been more or less sort of natural? Was there more or less sort of flexibility there to do that? And then once it expands outwards to like everybody's Passover, is that something, like, is it an aspect of Judaism, I guess is the question I'm asking, or is it like, activists kind of finding their angles?
When you speak to the activists, right, which I know you've done, you'll know that they will often focus as much on the internecine conflicts within the movement, as opposed to the general shared conflict against the Soviet Union. But one of what I'm seeing in here is more points of convergence and the like. But one of the areas where there was some difference was to what extent should religion guide the movement's goals. So the very first drafts of the matzoh of hope ritual, which you're raising one of the existing matzahs you're at. Maybe you're adding a fourth matzah that was left, so you can do it however you want. You want to do it halachically, you can do it halachically. You don't want to, you don't have to. It said, so we know that Soviet Jews are not free. They're not free to learn of their past. They're not free to teach their children. This is Passover. You would expect that in this festival of freedom, they would say they are not free to leave. Let my people go. It's Exodus, right? The first drafts don't say that. Well, how can that be? Because the religion was not guiding at that moment. Okay. This is 1960s. It's before Americans knew that Soviet Jews themselves were raising their voices, saying, let us go. It was still while Israel and the Soviet Union had diplomatic relations, so calling for emigration was diplomatically problematic.
Right.
After the Six-Day War, after the Soviets cut ties, after we learned that there are Soviet Jews who were saying, let us out, we then followed. And so then the later matzahs of hope, number one, they are not free to leave. Okay? Now, and that's what you're seeing from the American Jewish Conference, which is, it has to represent a lot of different organizations to build consensus. Right? So they're going to be very concerned about letting religion take the lead. The student struggle, its core is here. I mean, it's all over the country, but and North America, but its core is here. Its core is modern Orthodox, conservative. They're religiously educated, and they live in a religious idiom. Right. It's much easier for them to do this and feel like it's comfortable and their own thing. So the religion can cut both ways. Right. If you frame this movement as quote unquote too religious, and only speak in a Jewish idiom, how are you going to build allies? Right. So this was a tension within the movement.
Right. Tell me about the trips, because I sort of encountered some of this too, when I was doing my own research, is that you delved into it in a lot of depth. I just sort of would like hear these stories that sounded like the most exciting moment in most of these people's lives, and I read just a bit of these reports, which I know you delved into in great depth as your source material, which people really describe these extraordinary experiences of being in the Soviet Union and going to visit refuseniks secretly, kind of breaking off from their official tours. And so, like, what did those tours do for? What did it do for the movement? I mean, like, what did it provide?
Yeah. So the first uses of travel were elite.
Okay.
The Israelis sent Elie Wiesel, and he writes The Jews of Silence as a result of that.
Right.
Only he tells in his memoirs later that the Israelis sent him. At the time, people didn't know.
I mean, this is before '67.
This is before
'67.
Yeah. And what happens? The Israelis, when the Soviets sever ties and they kick out the Israeli diplomats, they're also kicking out the Israeli agents who were working with Soviet Jewry. So now Israel has lost its connection. So what does it do? It looks to Jews who have dual citizenship, the European passports, and it starts sending them.
Okay.
Okay, so the Israelis pioneer this use of regular people to become conduits to Soviet Jews. In the States, word of this starts to filter out, and people who are traveling for the Israelis are also connected with American movement organizations, and they start telling them this is what they're doing and how they're doing it. The Union of Councils for Soviet Jews needs to create its own line of connection with Soviet Jews because it does not want the Israelis are trying to control what they're doing.
Right.
And they're using the control over information. So to create an independent line of information, they start trying to send tourists themselves. They have a need to do this.
Right.
Now, once they're doing this, you have American Jews who are going to the groups that are connected with the establishment American Jewish Conference and saying, hey, send us. But the American Jewish Conference is getting the information from the Israelis. They don't have a need to send the tourists, but the Union of Councils is here and is doing this. And so you have some conflict between the organizations, right? Well, are we going to get left behind? So they get involved. So the question of how did the travel serve the movement itself, it provided information. It got information back. It provided direct support, actual aid, medical aid, material aid, and moral support as well to Soviet Jews. Later,
I imagine they were getting names out too.
Then,
people
yeah,
who wanted
exactly.
visas. And,
Exactly. Long lists.
Yeah.
And so they were updating with case files of all the refuseniks so they could monitor what was going on. And they were able to use this to, this individual had such and such a situation or needs this type of medication. You're coming back. We now know what the update is. You're now going, and we're going to get here's your meds, and now tell us what the new situation is legally. So they were able to do that.
Right.
But at the same time, they were asking for reports, and people were writing these reports that went way beyond anything that the organizations needed.
Right.
They're talking about, you get long descriptions of what they ate for breakfast and what the food in the hotels was like. And
because it was a role that people felt they were, like, say, sort of embodied while they were on these trips. Right?
Absolutely.
They were like, I'm an intelligence agent.
Yes,
gathering.
absolutely. And the movement organizations were sending them right in their briefing kits again and again and again. Do not play James Bond. You are not James Bond. This is not a spy game. You are going to help people.
Right.
Don't forget what this is about.
Right.
And the reason they keep repeating it is it's inevitable. This is how people experience themselves, because guess what? They are actually being followed by the KGB.
Right.
The rooms are being tapped. They are getting calls in the middle of the night.
Right.
Their luggage is being rummaged through. They are having these really contentious encounters with the customs agents. Some of them are getting arrested. Some of them are getting beaten. Right. Some of them are getting expelled, a minority.
Right.
But this actually was dangerous work.
And they're not supposed, my understanding was always, you can only go through, like, in tourist, right?
Yeah.
It has to be an organized trip. So these visits that they were making to refuseniks were sort of off the grid.
They were off the grid. I guess they were technically illegal from the Soviet context in that, right? You're supposed to stay with your in-tourist guide. And so people were getting trained in how do you slip away from the trip. Right. The Soviets knew exactly what was going on. The in-tourist guides knew exactly what was going on. They cracked down when they wanted to crack down. One of the things that I noticed in looking through the trip reports, and I created a database that let me synthesize some of the information to get a larger profile, statistical profile of it, is that the people who were getting harassed and expelled, it was often leaders of the Union of Councils were getting kicked out. They then also started kicking out some of the leaders of the American Jewish Conference, but it generally was not the random tourist who was getting super harassed. It was someone who had some position of leadership in the American movement. The Soviets knew.
And so they would, like, target those people, those specific people.
Yeah.
Did you gauge, to the extent that you could, sort of a difference in sort of identification and in the strength of commitment to the movement from people who, before and after they went?
It's a huge part of their narratives, of how they tell their own story. And that, how did the tourism serve the movement? The activists understood pretty quickly, this is a leadership recruitment mechanism. Yeah. We send people who we think are promising, and they're going to come back and get super involved. And you have national leaders who they really cut their teeth on by going on these. Right.
It always seemed to me too that, because there were certain refuseniks like Vladimir Slepak, who were like central hubs, that this also created that cadre of refuseniks who were the most well known in the States, and sort of that sort of communication began.
And and it was interesting. There's a real inequality. I was able to see this. I was able to see by looking at all of these. There are thousands of trip reports in the American Jewish Historical Society archives. They're all online, by the way. So you can just go online and search for a name.
And we also we said before, we want to shout out, give a shout out to the archives here, which we both spend a lot of time in, and is an extraordinary resource.
When you put all this stuff together, you begin to notice things. So, for example, not all refuseniks were treated equally, and not all tourists were treated equally. They would send activist leaders in the States would meet with the leadership of the refusenik movement. And repeatedly you get complaints from the refuseniks, listen, we're overburdened, you're sending too many people. And so the response is, okay, we're going to send our lower level people to your peripheral activists, the ones who aren't really involved. We'll only send you the top leadership. So it actually helped to create a pecking order on both sides of the ocean of activist leadership. And
so in a way, like, it's structured some hierarchy within the movement. Interesting. Well, so I want to turn to this sort of other dimension of this, while we have a few more minutes, which is sort of how everything that you're describing, this culture you're describing, shaped American Jews. How did it, because so much of it is inward focused, right? It occurred to me many times in my own research that Soviet Jews didn't even know half of what was happening. And in fact, part of the absurdity of of when they finally get out is sort of encountering, oh, you were doing all of this? This was this central part of Russian Jews and Russian Jewish kids of Russian Jews who read my book, say, we had no idea that this was such an important part of your own identity and your own culture. So talk to me sort of bigger picture, like what role this played at this pivot moment of American Jewish sort of history.
People say, oh, you're writing a book about Soviet Jewry. I said, no, I'm writing a book about American Jewry, right? They imagined Soviet Jews in certain ways. In general, American Jews imagined Soviet Jews as the refusnik leadership. It turns out the refusnik leadership was the refusnik leadership, and most Soviet Jews were not the refusnik leadership. They had different interests and the like. But this is a movement that's happening in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And you can think about what's going on in the world more broadly. What historical context do you want to put this in? Right? This is a post-Holocaust movement. And one of the slogans was, this time we shall not be silent. Holocaust consciousness, post-Holocaust trauma, guilt, baby boomers telling their parents you didn't do enough. Right? All it was super, super present. Right? That's one way of looking at it. Okay, this is also a movement that is happening amidst the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, all of these ethnic pride movements. Right? So now these are American Jews taking to the streets, demanding rights for Jews, right? And saying, we're going to be proud in public. We're not going to be shah still. So in that sense, it's an American movement too, right? That looks very much like movements of the pride movements of the 70s. It's also the Cold War, right? And these are Americans who are demanding freedom, right? Often they'll frame it as religious freedom. The Israelis would speak about it as national freedom. Americans were more likely to speak about it as religious. But it's a Cold War moment, and it could make it. All these things came together in this one moment. It really was a moment of time that brought different aspects of Jewish American global culture together for the people who were involved in it.
I mean, the moment that I'm going to ask one more question, then I think we're going to start passing out cards so that people can ask their own questions. But the moment that it occurred to me what an American movement it was in this confrontation with the Israelis, where there was suddenly this moment of realization of we're thinking about this one way and you're thinking about it as another. For you, it's a Zionist movement where these Russian Jews should be going to Israel because that's their homeland. And for us, this is a freedom movement where we're not going to tell people who just emerged from a autocratic a dictatorial situation, where they can live. So that seemed to me a real sort of reckoning with the different ways that people had conceived of the
very much so. I think other historians of American Jewry can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my sense is that there was no moment other than this in which American Jews more fully embraced their own empowerment as American Jews. You have a community that was willing to go up against the White House when the Nixon administration was reluctant to take this up as an issue. American Jews, said, no, it doesn't matter, Nixon. This is important to us, and we're going to stand firm. We pushed back against our own government when the Israeli government said, steer all the immigrants to Israel, and we said, no, we're Americans, and we're talking about freedom of movement. Right? So we pushed back against the American government. We pushed back against the Israeli government. Tell me another time when American Jews were that self-confident, that self-empowered, that they said, they took on 2 superpowers and the state of Israel at the same time and said, you need to deal with us as an independent authority or power.
Right. Do we have some questions? I say that the one thing that I was jealous of a lot of great research you have in here, but the first thing that I was jealous of was the epigraph, which is this quote from Henry Kissinger, which probably a good majority of you know about this famous quote, that now infamous quote that emerged from the Nixon tapes about Kissinger talking about the Soviet Jewry movement in this very shockingly disparaging ways.
Would you read it?
Yeah, you can
read
the quote.
Get the quote exactly. The emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. And if they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern. One of the working titles for the book was An American Concern.
So tell me why I when that came out, my book was already out, and I was like, no, because sometimes this piece of information that clarifies everything that because like nothing captures his realpolitik like more perfectly than that quote. But why did it feel important to put that as an epigraph?
Because I think that, first, to the extent that people remember the movement, they assume, look, this was a Cold War movement. It was American Jews facing off against the Soviet Union. And of course America would be on board with that.
Right.
This was détente.
Right.
And this was threatening détente. And we had to actually say, wait a second, human rights matter. And for all this realpolitik, we're not going to sacrifice our brothers and sisters.
Right. So it's it really illustrates what the stakes were.
Yeah. Also, this book is about one phase of the mobilization. Right. So the model that activists had was, we can't pressure the Soviets, we cannot force them to change their policy. The U.S. government may have leverage to pressure the Soviets to change policy.
Right.
We need to get the U.S. government on our side to take this up as its issue.
Right.
But how do we get the government to take this up? We need a mass mobilization of American Jews.
Right.
And so this is looking at that first moment. How do they create a mass mobilization of American Jews in order to go through this chain? So this is showing that the American government was also a target of this movement, and that American government support was not foreordained. It didn't exist at the beginning. There was a lot, lip service was all basically that there was in the beginning. So.
Oh, okay. Was there a particular sort of piece of a particular discovery in the archives that stays with you that you think that was the most surprising?
There were 2. I mentioned one before, which was that my own bar mitzvah twin had already gotten out and was in Israel. And so what I had thought was censorship was disorganization among the activists. 1982 was early in the Bar and Bat Mitzvah twinning. And the activists didn't really have their act together in terms of.
Well, I should maybe you would know the answer to this. I've heard people say to me that they have suspicions that everybody had the same Soviet twin. And that there was
There were more American kids who wanted to have twins than there were children of refuseniks.
Right.
And just like with the visits to tourists, there were some refusnik kids who had more twins than others. So, and I have some statistics and numbers in here. There was one, there was one girl in the early 1980s who had something like 30 twins, and then there was one boy who had just one. So I guess this one is probably better to have more people mobilizing for you. But most of us, I think, thought that this was our unique twin. It was not. The activists did try to tell them that, but who listened?
Right. There's a question about the civil rights movement and sort of understanding the inspiration for elements of the movement,
Yeah.
what was borrowed or inspired by.
Yeah. So civil rights movement culture informed a lot of the early activism, 1960s. You'll see it a lot in student struggle activism and the rhetoric that's being used. So just speaking of it as a rights movement. The very first march, public demonstration, was a march around the Soviet UN mission,
right,
on May Day.
Jericho March, right?
This is before the Jericho March, right? But it was a silent march. People were dressed in the boys were dressed in suit and ties, and the girls were dressed in in skirts and long sleeves.
Right.
But this was consciously modeled after civil rights movement style marching. So that informed the youth culture a lot. It was less prevalent in the activism that you'll see from the older from the older generations. But as people aged, also they carried this with them.
Okay. A question that is always a question that I feel like I have to field often, which is sort of what happened once Soviet Jews got out.
Yeah.
All of this enthusiasm and sort of the culture that built around getting them out.
Yeah.
And then it seems like there was a real sort of moment of dissonance of like both encountering the people, but also not knowing how to sort of So speak to that a little bit.
Yeah.
Because,
so at this moment, when the Soviet Union is collapsing, Jews are getting, the government changes its policy even before the Soviet Union dissolves. Jews are getting out. Soviet Union dissolves 1991, and there's more emigration, but there's nothing to mobilize against at that point. And it's interesting, like 1990, 1991, in American Jewish history and in the American Jewish public conversation, they talk about this moment as the moment of the continuity crisis. And that whole, it was framed around issues of intermarriage and assimilation and the like. But I think it's really important. I think we're missing something if we don't understand how the end of the Soviet Jewry movement actually helped to create a sense of crisis among American Jews. Because this movement was ubiquitous in our institutions.
Right.
You could not go into a synagogue, a JCC, a federation, a Jewish family service, a summer camp, you name it, without encountering mobilization for Soviet Jewry. It had religious dimensions, and the reason that we had this was because we had activists and organizations constantly putting it on the agenda. And then in a second they stopped. They all stopped.
Yeah.
So there's a huge vacuum.
And what fills that vacuum?
A sense of crisis is what fills it.
Right.
A sense of crisis.
Why didn't it then become sort of a mission around absorbing Russian Jews or helping them?
I've been thinking about
integrating
that.
them into American Jewish life.
Yeah.
Which is a harder mission.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's a much harder. It's also a mission that's closer to home. Or we're thinking about oppressed Soviet Jews overseas are a symbol. Right. Your neighbor, who you know by name, is not a symbol.
Right.
And if you're imagining them as a symbol, they don't want to be seen as a symbol. They want to be seen as themselves. And so a lot of the clashes that then, the conflicts that happened between American Jews and Soviet immigrants about these, Larissa Remenek, who's a scholar of the emigration, calls it a crisis of failed mutual expectations, or a crisis of mutual failed expectations, something like that.
Great way of
That's exactly what it was, right? So look, this is at home. But think about what twinning is happening in the 1980s, right? There are already Soviet immigrants in the United States in the 1980s. You could imagine a different version of twinning that was not, let my Soviet twin leave, but I'm going to partner with the Soviet Jewish immigrant in my school.
Bring him on to the...
Right, exactly. And I'm just going to, and I'm not going to make a big deal about it, because this is social welfare work, so we're going to actually do it Maimonides style and keep it quiet to preserve the dignity of the person who we're helping.
Right.
That's not how activists chose to do it.
Yeah.
I don't know that activists even thought of doing it that way, but we never mobilized in that sense around that resettlement as a symbol in the States.
Right. I mean, the other dimension was like what the Soviet Jews themselves had a kind of Jewish identity that was hard for American Jews to sort of integrate or understand, at first. The question about, was there any pushback of the movement within the Jewish world or a broader geopolitical world? And I guess the sort of spin I would put on that would be, was there anybody who thought sort of making Soviet Jewry such a, expansive part of Jewish culture was a problem, or was or was taking away from Israel, or from some absorption, or was there any pushback to the idea of how pervasive this became?
Yeah, most of the pushback came from some Haredi communities.
Okay.
And the issue and the concern was, now these were communities that actually were maintaining contact with Jews in the Soviet Union, and that were providing religious support, but they were doing it quietly. And they were concerned that public activism was going to, one, threaten Soviet Jews, two, make it harder for them to actually continue this clandestine work to support religious life in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And the religious dimensions, they thought, look, this is especially dangerous because if you are going out and marching with your Torah scroll in your Soviet Jewry march, which is what we did,
right?
You're turning the Torah into what the Soviets will say is an anti-Soviet political symbol. And so then when Jews are going to use that Torah scroll in a synagogue to worship, the Soviets are going to stop them from doing it for those reasons because it was used in a protest demonstration.
I see.
So they were. So
I mean, that could be. That seems like a legitimate kind of, at least a worry.
That was a worry.
Yeah.
Now this was outside of the Haredi community. That position was ended up being rejected. This is the spirit of activism, the work of the youth activists, the sense of Holocaust guilt and shame for not having done more, basically trumped everything. And
right.
It's like,
so
no,
even in the modern Orthodox world, there wasn't. I mean,
right. And Adam Ferziger, who has written about this as well, he's at Bar Ilan University, talks about how much the Soviet Jewry movement was involved in creating this solidarity. He calls it solidarity orthodoxy. But you can imagine you can imagine a version of Orthodox Jewish life that stayed away from activism. Oh, look, everyone's marching on the streets. That's secular. That's non-Jewish. You had an Orthodox Judaism at that time that was bringing in the 1960s style activism and their Jewishness into one.
Right. There's a question about whether you did any research on the Soviet Jewry movement in the UK, Canada, and other parts of the world.
Yes. Yeah, the book is entitled American, but you can't. I mean, you found this too. You can't just study this as in one country. This goes all over the world. In the United Kingdom, in here specifically, there's some stuff about a group called the 35s, which was the women's campaign for Soviet Jewry, and what they did with the Soviet Jewry medallions. So
what were those? I don't know.
Okay, so now you'll after October 7th, you'll see that people are wearing. I'm sorry, I'm making the noise, but the hostage tags. But back in the 70s, this jewelry had the name of a Soviet Jewish prisoner of conscience, and it began in the States, in California, not as bracelets, but as medallions in the 1970s. This was a time that other Americans were wearing, Jewish Americans too, were wearing POW and MIA bracelets, the Vietnam War. And the activists in the Soviet Jewry movement didn't want to compete bracelet to bracelet, but they liked the idea, so they developed jewelry. So they have a CPA from Encino or from somewhere who creates a Soviet Jewry medallion. How does he come up designing jewelry? Don't ask me. This thing goes over to Europe, and Doreen Gainsford, who's active head of the 35s at the time, marches into a jewelry shop on German Street to a guy named Andrew Grima, I don't know how to pronounce the name. I've only seen it written. But he was a jeweler to Princess Anne, to Ursula Andress, who was the first Bond girl. He was jeweler to the royalty and to the stars. And like, if they're going to do jewelry, don't give it to a CPA and Encino to design. You go to the best jeweler. And he pro bono designed a medallion for the 35s for the prisoner Silva Zalmanson.
Yes.
And they sold that, and you could buy it at different price points. You could get it in silver, gold, platinum. So the American version was like $1.
Yeah.
You could spend 500 pounds in 1970 something for the platinum version.
And was this like, would part of that money go to the 35? Or was like people just wanted to
funded the organization.
Funded the organization.
Yeah. The Union of Councils needed to find lots of ways to fund for independent funding. So the medallions were Cy Frumkin and Zev Yaroslavsky are the ones who put this together out in California. And they're actually like stamping the names in their office, but they're producing it for cents and they're selling it for dollars. So all this stuff, it's just profit. And they're selling 100,000 of these medallions. So it's this helped the Union of Councils to become financially independent.
A question here about whether there was a particular pivotal moment that brought the movement to a head. I guess that's a sort of a wider
question. I would say the pivotal moment is probably around the arrest of Boris Kochubeyevsky, who was the first named political prisoner. Before that, this is 1968, 68. His name comes out in 68, and before that, Americans could mobilize for Soviet Jewry. Can you name me a Soviet Jew?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. After that, it switched. And so you don't have bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah twinning. You don't have adoption of prisoners. You don't have the bracelets with Anatoly Sharansky's name on it unless you have the ability to know actual Soviet Jewish activists.
Right.
And the tactics that the movement use shift. They become personalized at that moment once they have a named political prisoner. Huge. And unsung. Like, it seems like, who knows about that?
We have one more question. It's the inevitable question for our times that we
I
talked about. But basically, talk to me about like generalized lessons from this movement that people thinking today about Israel and wanting to advocate on behalf of Israel could possibly, emulate.
So I can say a few things about this. Some are brighter, some are darker. First, the Soviet government Soviet government was officially against anti-Semitism, right? So they called what they were doing anti-Zionism. And in the States, we always, pushed back against that. No, it's anti-Semitism, and look, here how, let's grant them the term. You know what? They practiced all these types of persecutions of Jews under the name of anti-Zionism. All right, you know what? That's what it is. So I think at this point, we need to acknowledge the history of the term, and we need to acknowledge its historical antecedents as to what we're seeing here. That these ideas don't just emerge in a vacuum. They're not born de novo. They didn't spring up last year, but there's an intellectual history to this, and this is a concept that has practices that are associated with it that have been bad for Jewish life in a lot of places. So that would be one. Just okay,
So the merging, just so that I understand, the Soviet merging of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, or their anti-Zionism being a form of anti-Semitism.
Let's not get don't get caught up in what is and what isn't. We had a set of practices. They closed down synagogues. They murdered rabbis. They refused emigration at the same time that they're selling weapons to countries that are trying to destroy Israel. They called this anti-Zionism.
All of it anti-Zionism.
They called it anti-Zionism. If they called it anti-Zionism, let's grant them the term.
Right.
Okay. Just focus on what the practices are and what the effects are.
Okay.
That's one. Second, and this is one. We'll go a little bit darker. I think that one of the things that the protesters on the campuses, in the encampments, have learned is that it feels really good to stand up and protest when Jews are the enemy to be protested against. And one of the lessons from this book, and this is what differentiates a cultural movement from a political movement, is the experience of being in the movement and all these feelings of empowerment and solidarity and the like, the people in those encampments have gotten.
Yes.
And those feelings are attached to a sense that Jews are the enemy. That is dangerous. That is dangerous for us in the short term. It's dangerous for us in the long term because people are going to look back with nostalgia to their time in these encampments when they were fighting their righteous cause when we Jews are the enemy. This notion of the experience of being active, the experience of activism, is a key part in this book of what I'm arguing about how did it create an American Jewish identity. We felt this in our bones. It was not just something that we understood intellectually. We felt this movement. They're feeling it too. And I think that's something to be concerned about. And then in terms of thinking about activism and responses, mobilize everything, everyone, everywhere. This is, and don't think about this only in political terms. This is, Soviet Jewry movement created a cultural movement. That's how they sustained it. And I think we need to be thinking in those broad terms.
Elements like, focusing on the identities of the hostages, for example, like that would be like a legacy of the movement in some ways. Just kind of understanding that kind of identification and humanization.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and you think about the rally in November, which was November 2023, which was larger than the rally in the Soviet Jewry rally in 1987.
Yeah.
Which in '87 that was the largest rally in American Jewish history. It's now been surpassed. Sharansky was involved in the ideas for planning both, and the memory of the Soviet Jewry movement was at play in thinking about organizing this rally. So the legacies of this movement, even though it ended, there's a generation of American Jews who remembers this and is thinking about activism today through these lenses.
Right.
Part of what I'm arguing is that we have forgotten a lot of the deeper lessons because we focused on a few things. We focused on Jackson Vanik. We focused on the big 1987 rally, which was at the end of the movement, not at the beginning. You don't turn out 250,000 people unless you've done an enormous amount of organizing beforehand. Right. This is about all this. You wrote about this in your book, right? The quiet before, all the slow organizing that's going on. Right. And that's what you're looking at in here.
Fantastic. Well, it is an extraordinary book, and I'm so glad that it exists. And it's such a great contribution to our understanding of this story. And I do think that there's so many important lessons that can be extrapolated. So thank you so much,
Thank
Shaul.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.